That morning, my phone buzzed with a notification that would have sent any normal 72-year-old man straight to the emergency room. A $0 bank balance. My entire life savings gone in a single overnight wire transfer. While I was sitting at my kitchen table staring at the empty screen, my future daughter-in-law called. She did not sound apologetic. She sounded triumphant. She said she took the money and she sold my house to pay for her dream wedding. She told me to pack my bags and stay away from the ceremony because I no longer fit into their perfect high-class aesthetic. She thought she had left me with absolutely nothing. She had no idea that she had just sold my house to the one person she should have been terrified of. Me. Before I tell you how I turned her perfect $200,000 wedding into her worst nightmare, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an entitled person a hard lesson about respect and boundaries. Now let us get back to that morning. The sun was just starting to rise over Atlanta, casting a warm golden glow through the kitchen windows. I had lived in this house for 40 years. My late wife Vivian and I bought it when Andre, my only son, was just a toddler. I poured my morning black coffee, savoring the quiet peace of the neighborhood. I sat down at the oak dining table, put on my reading glasses, and unlocked my tablet. I just wanted to pay my monthly Georgia Power utility bill. I opened my banking application. I navigated to the joint checking account. It was an account I had set up years ago, shortly after Vivian passed away. I had added Andre to it just in case something ever happened to me medically, so he could handle my affairs without jumping through legal hoops. The balance the night before had been $85,412. It was a modest, comfortable sum that anyone looking from the outside would assume was the entirety of a retired railway worker's nest egg. I blinked. I took off my glasses, wiped the lenses on my shirt, and put them back on. The numbers on the screen did not change. Available balance, $0 and 0 cents. A cold numbness crept down my arms. I tapped the transaction history. There it was. An outgoing wire transfer processed at 2 in the morning. The destination was an escrow account tied to a luxury event planning company in Buckhead. Every single penny had been drained. Not $50 was left for a tank of gas. Not even $5 for a cup of coffee. As I sat there processing the reality that my own son had just wiped out my savings, my cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed Chloe. Chloe was Andre's fiancée. She was a woman who walked into rooms like she owned the building, despite never having worked a hard day in her life. From the moment Andre brought her home, she had made her disdain for me painfully obvious. She complained about the neighborhood. She scoffed at the homemade meals I cooked. She treated me not like a future father-in-law, but like an inconvenient charity case her handsome fiancé was burdened with. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger settle deep in my chest. I swiped the screen to answer and put the phone on speaker. "Good morning, Solomon," Chloe said. Her voice was painfully bright, dripping with a sugary sweetness that I knew concealed pure venom. "Good morning, Chloe," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I am looking at my bank statement." "Oh, good," she said, letting out a soft, dismissive laugh. "That saves me the trouble of explaining. Look, Solomon, let us be adults about this. My wedding is tomorrow. You know how important this day is to me. The venue, the flowers, the catering, it all cost nearly $200,000. Andre promised me the wedding of my dreams, but his salary just was not covering the final payments. We were going to lose the Grand Magnolia estate. I could not let that happen. So you stole $85,000 from my retirement account," I said. "Do not use such ugly words, Solomon," she snapped, dropping the sweet act immediately. "We did not steal anything. Andre is on the account. It is his money, too. Besides, you are 72 years old. What do you even need that kind of money for? You sit in that old house all day watching sports. We are starting a life. We need it more than you do. Consider it your contribution to our future." The audacity of her words hung in the air. I looked around my kitchen. The cabinets I had built with my own 2 hands, the floorboards I had replaced, and my house, I asked quietly. "Ah, yes, the house." Chloe sighed as if she were discussing the weather rather than destroying a man's life. "We actually found a brilliant solution for that, too. Since the bank account was not quite enough to cover the honeymoon to the Maldives and my custom dress, we sold it. The silence in my kitchen was absolute. Only the steady ticking of the wall clock could be heard over the phone's speaker. "You sold my house?" I repeated. "Yes," she said cheerfully. Andre felt terrible about it, of course, but I made him see reason. You are getting older, Solomon. Your mental health is clearly declining. You live alone in a 4-bedroom property that is entirely too big for you. We used a quick cash real estate agency. They bought it as is. The funds cleared yesterday. Do not worry, we left you about $1,000 in an envelope in Andre's old bedroom so you can get a deposit on a little senior apartment somewhere quiet. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask her how she managed to legally sell a property that had my name on the deed. I knew immediately that paper forgery was involved. I knew that my son, the boy I had raised, had stood by and watched this woman strip me down to nothing. One more thing, Solomon. Chloe continued, her tone turning sharp and commanding. Since the house officially belongs to the new buyers on Monday, you need to start packing immediately. And regarding the wedding tomorrow, Andre and I had a long talk. We think it is best if you do not attend. My parents are flying in from Boston, and a lot of very important people will be there. Given your current living situation and, well, your lack of resources, we do not want any awkwardness. You understand, right? Just stay home. Pack your boxes. Have a nice life. She hung up. The line went dead. I sat alone at my dining table for a long time. Any other man would have broken down in tears. Any other father would have called the police in a hysterical panic, screaming about betrayal. But I did not cry. And I did not panic. They thought they had outsmarted a helpless old man. They thought I was just a retired railway worker with a single bank account and a dusty old house. They had no idea about the life I had built after the railway. They had no idea about the commercial properties I owned, the holding companies I controlled, or the legal team I kept on retainer. Chloe thought she had buried me. She did not realize she had just handed me the shovel. I stood up from the table. I picked up my empty coffee mug and placed it carefully in the sink. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom, slid open the closet door, and bypassed the casual clothes I usually wore. I reached into the back and pulled out a charcoal gray custom-tailored suit. It was time to pay a visit to the local bank branch. I needed to see exactly whose name was forged on that power of attorney. And then I was going to make a phone call that would turn Chloe's dream wedding into a spectacular, inescapable trap. The drive to the downtown branch of the First National Bank took exactly 22 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I just listened to the hum of the engine and the sound of my own steady breathing. Most men my age would be hyperventilating, rushing to the police station, or calling their lawyers in a blind panic. But panic is a luxury for the weak. I learned a long time ago that when someone strikes you, the worst thing you can do is show them your pain. You observe, you gather your strength, and then you strike back when they think they have already won. As I steered my car down the familiar streets of Atlanta, my mind drifted back to the day I opened that joint account with Andre. It was 7 years ago. The pain of losing Vivian was still so fresh, it felt like a physical weight on my chest. Vivian was the love of my life. She was the woman who stood by me when I was just a grease-stained mechanic working double shifts at the railway yard. We built our life together dollar by dollar. When she passed away, a part of me died with her. I felt tired. I felt old. A few weeks after her funeral, I asked Andre to come with me to the bank. I wanted to make sure that if my heart suddenly gave out, he would not be left scrambling to pay for my burial or fighting through probate court to access my funds. I trusted him. He was my only child. I looked him in the eye that day, handed him the pen, and told him that this money was our family safety net. It was not a gift. It was a responsibility. He took the pen, looked at me with tears in his eyes, and promised he would always protect our family legacy. Now that same boy had handed my life savings over to a woman who treated me like dirt on the bottom of her expensive shoes. He did not just break a promise. He shattered the foundation of everything his mother and I had built for him. I parked my car in front of the branch. I walked through the heavy glass doors with my head held high. The air conditioning inside was sharp and cold. I did not go to the teller line. I walked straight to the glass office at the back. The branch manager, a younger man named Mr. Mitchell, looked up from his computer. When he saw me, the color completely drained from his face. He knew exactly who I was, and judging by the panic in his eyes, he knew exactly why I was there. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," I said quietly as I stepped into his office and closed the door behind me. "I believe we need to have a conversation about a wire transfer that was authorized from my account at 2 o'clock this morning." Mr. Mitchell swallowed hard. He stood up nervously, adjusting his tie, and gestured for me to sit down. "Mr. Pierce," he stammered, I assure you everything was processed according to the legal documentation provided to us. I personally reviewed the paperwork yesterday afternoon when your son and his fiancée came in. My son and his fiancée, I repeated, letting the words hang in the silent room. Mr. Mitchell, I did not authorize an $85,000 withdrawal. I did not authorize the closing of that account. I want to see the paperwork they provided you. Mitchell hesitated for a moment, then opened his desk drawer. His hands were shaking slightly as he pulled out a thick manila folder. He opened it and slid a stapled document across the polished wood of his desk. I leaned forward and looked at it. It was a general power of attorney. The document was meticulously drafted. It had all the right legal jargon. It had a notary stamp. And at the bottom of the last page it had my signature, or at least an incredibly good forgery of my signature. But it was not the signature that made my blood run cold. It was the paragraph right above it. I read the words slowly. It stated that due to my rapidly declining mental health, severe memory loss, and inability to manage my own basic financial affairs, I was willingly surrendering complete control of my assets to my son, Andre Pierce. They did not just steal my money. They documented me as a senile, incompetent old man. Chloe had orchestrated this. I was certain of it. But Andre had signed off on it. He had sat in this very office, looked this bank manager in the eye, and legally declared that his father had lost his mind. He sold my dignity to pay for catering and floral arrangements. Did you speak to me to verify this condition, Mr. Mitchell? I asked, my voice dangerously low. I have been banking here for nearly 4 decades. Do I look like a man who has lost his mind? Mitchell wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. Sir, the document was fully notarized. Your son explained that your condition fluctuates. He said you have good days and bad days, and that you are currently residing in a specialized care facility. They also provided the escrow instructions for the sale of your primary residence. I kept my expression entirely blank, though my heart was pounding against my ribs. The house sale. Chloe had gloated about it on the phone, but seeing the reality of it validated by the bank manager was a different level of betrayal. Tell me about the house, I said. Who bought it? Where did the funds go? Mitchell typed quickly on his keyboard, clearly desperate to be as helpful as possible to avoid my anger. The real estate agency processed a quick cash buyout, he explained. They deposited the funds directly into the same escrow account used for the wedding venue. It appears your son and his fiancée used the house equity to clear the final vendor balances. Who was the buyer? I asked again, leaning closer to his desk. When a quick cash agency buys a property, they are usually fronting for a larger holding company. I want the name of the entity that currently holds the deed to my home. Mitchell squinted at his screen, scrolling through the transaction details. It is a corporate buyer, he said. A commercial real estate firm. Let me see. Yes, here it is. The property was legally transferred to an LLC called Apex Holdings. Apex Holdings. The name echoed in the quiet office. Mitchell looked at me, expecting me to show confusion or despair. He expected me to ask him how I could fight this anonymous corporate giant to get my home back. He expected an old, tired man to break down in tears at the realization that he was completely ruined. Instead, a slow, dark smile crept across my face. I stood up from the chair and smoothed the front of my suit jacket. Thank you for your time, Mr. Mitchell, I said. I have everything I need. But Mr. Pierce, he called out as I reached for the door handle. What are you going to do? Do you want me to call the fraud department? We can try to freeze the remaining vendor accounts, but it might be too late. Do nothing, I told him, looking back over my shoulder. Let every single transaction go through. Let them spend every last dime. I walked out of the bank and stepped back into the warm Atlanta sun. My son and his vicious fiancée thought they had pulled off the perfect crime. They thought they had sold my house to a faceless corporation that would kick me out onto the street. What they did not know, and what they were going to find out in the most humiliating way possible tomorrow, was that I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. My son did not sell my house to strangers. He sold it right back to me. And tomorrow I was going to collect my debts. I sat in the driver's seat of my car with the air conditioning running. I stared at the photocopy of the forged power of attorney. The steering wheel felt hot beneath my hands, even in the shade. The document in my lap was a masterpiece of deceit. Chloe had managed to find a notary willing to look the other way, or perhaps she just faked the stamp altogether. It did not matter. What mattered was the absolute arrogance of it all. They thought they were dealing with an ignorant, helpless old man who would simply fold under pressure and disappear into a cheap senior living facility. They did not know the truth. They did not know that the man they had just tried to rob was the architect of his own empire. When my late wife Vivian and I were younger, I did work for the railway. That part of my life was completely true. I spent 20 years getting my hands dirty, working double shifts and coming home smelling of grease and steel. But what Andre and his entitled fiancée never understood was what I did with the money I earned. In the late 1980s and early 90s, when property values in Atlanta were practically giving away dirt, I started buying. I bought rundown commercial lots. I bought abandoned warehouses. I bought strips of land that nobody wanted. I fixed them up, leased them out, and reinvested every single dollar. I never flaunted it. Vivian and I decided early on that we wanted our son to understand the value of a hard day of work. We stayed in our modest 4-bedroom house. I drove an old Ford. I wore my worn-out flannel shirts and simple jeans. We wanted Andre to build his own life, not wait around for a massive inheritance. But after Vivian passed away, I watched Andre change. He started chasing status. He started chasing friends who cared more about the label on his jacket than the content of his character. And then he found Chloe. Chloe was the ultimate parasite. She demanded luxury but refused to work for it. And she assumed, because I lived simply, that I was just a broke, pathetic old man standing in the way of her high society dreams. I reached into the center console of my car and pulled out my phone. I dialed a private number that very few people possessed. It was the direct line to the senior managing partner of the most ruthless corporate law firm in downtown Atlanta. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Jonathan speaking," the voice said. "Jonathan, it is Solomon," I replied, my voice completely steady. "Mr. Pierce," Jonathan said, his tone shifting immediately to one of deep respect. "Good morning, sir. I was actually just about to call you. We have a rather unusual situation regarding one of the recent property acquisitions authorized by the residential division of Apex Holdings." I smiled a slow, dark smile. Apex Holdings was my primary corporate umbrella. It was the parent company that owned dozens of subsidiaries, including a massive real estate investment trust. It was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and I was the sole proprietor. "Let me guess," I said. "A quick cash agency acting as a buyer for Apex Holdings just finalized the purchase of a 4-bedroom property on Elm Street." There was a brief pause on the line. "Yes, sir," Jonathan said, sounding highly confused. "Our automated acquisition software approved the purchase of the property yesterday afternoon based on the favorable market metrics. However, this morning a junior analyst in the compliance department flagged the file. He noticed the name on the original deed was Solomon Pierce. He escalated it immediately. The legal team halted the final clearance because we assumed it was some kind of elaborate fraud targeting you personally. We were preparing to contact the authorities." "It is fraud, Jonathan," I told him, watching the bank manager walk across the lobby through the glass doors. "But do not call the authorities just yet, and do not halt the clearance." Sir Jonathan said, his voice laced with concern. "I am looking at the digital scans of the transaction. The sellers used a power of attorney claiming you are mentally incapacitated. The funds, nearly $400,000 for the property value, were wired to an external escrow account tied to a wedding and event planning company in Buckhead. If we do not freeze this right now, the money will be dispersed to multiple vendors by tomorrow morning." "That is exactly what I want to happen," I said, leaning back against the leather seat of my car. There was absolute silence on the other end. Jonathan was a brilliant lawyer, but even he was struggling to process my command. "Sir, if I may ask, why would we let them steal your home and your money?" "Because they did not steal my home, Jonathan," I replied. "My son and his future wife forged my signature to sell my house to my own company. They used my own money from a joint bank account to pay the deposit for their absurdly expensive wedding. And now they are using the equity from my house to pay off the rest of the vendors. They think they have completely ruined me. They think I am going to be homeless tomorrow." "I understand," Sir Jonathan said slowly. "But what are your specific instructions?" "I want you to let the transaction go through," I instructed him, my voice turning cold and precise. "Let Apex Holdings officially take possession of the property, but I want you to put a lockdown on that escrow account the second the final vendor payments are cleared. I want every single dollar they spent to be legally classified as stolen funds obtained through federal wire fraud and elder abuse. Build the criminal case quietly." "Consider it done," Jonathan said, the hesitation vanishing from his voice, replaced by the sharp predatory instinct I paid him so well for. "And Jonathan," I added, "I need you to find out exactly where this wedding is taking place." Chloe mentioned the Grand Magnolia estate. I want you to look into the financial status of that venue. Find out who holds their debt or who owns the property. Give me 5 minutes, Mr. Pierce, Jonathan said. I hung up the phone and closed my eyes. The heat of the day was rising, but I felt nothing but ice in my veins. Andre had made his choice. He had looked at the man who gave him life, the man who paid for his education, the man who loved him unconditionally, and decided I was nothing more than an obstacle to his miserable, shallow existence. He chose a woman who treated people like garbage over his own flesh and blood. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text message from Jonathan. It contained 3 short sentences. The Grand Magnolia estate is deeply in debt. They are facing commercial foreclosure next month. Apex Holdings can purchase their outstanding loans within the hour. I stared at the screen, a low chuckle escaping my throat. It was almost too perfect. Chloe had stolen my money to rent the most expensive, exclusive venue in the state of Georgia. She wanted to show off to her wealthy parents and her snobby friends. She wanted to prove that she had finally arrived. I typed a quick reply to my lawyer. Buy the debt. Buy the venue. Make me the owner by the end of the day. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the bank. The plan was set. The trap was laid. Chloe thought she was going to have the wedding of the century tomorrow. She thought she was going to walk down the aisle as a wealthy, upper-class bride, leaving her pathetic old father-in-law to rot in a cheap apartment. She had no idea that she had just sold my house to me, and she had no idea that she was about to host her dream wedding on my property. The ultimate facade was about to come crashing down, and I was going to be the one holding the sledgehammer. I was going to let her put on her white dress. I was going to let her invite her 200 guests. I was going to let her stand at the altar. Because a private betrayal requires a public execution, the game was no longer about saving my money. It was about teaching them a lesson they would never, ever forget. I parked my car across the street from a boutique menswear store in the heart of the Buckhead district. It was the kind of neighborhood where people cared more about the designer label on your clothing than the actual content of your character. The storefront had massive glass windows displaying mannequins dressed in tuxedos that cost more than what most hardworking people made in a month. I knew Andre would be here. Chloe had practically bragged about his custom-fitted Italian silk tuxedo on social media earlier that week. I stepped out of my car and adjusted the cuffs of my charcoal gray suit. I took a deep breath of the warm Atlanta air. I was about to do something no father ever wants to do. I was about to look my only son in the eye and give him one final chance to save himself from total destruction. I wanted him to confess. I wanted him to break down, tell me the truth, and apologize. If he did that, I might have shown him some mercy. But I needed to see his face when I asked him. I needed to know if the boy I raised alongside my beautiful Vivian was still in there somewhere, or if he was completely gone. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the boutique. The air inside smelled of expensive cologne, polished leather, and entitlement. A young man working as a sales associate immediately approached me with a polite but questioning look. He took one glance at my tailored suit, recognized the quality of the fabric, and immediately offered me a glass of champagne. I politely declined and told him I was just looking for my son. I heard laughter coming from the back of the store. I walked past the racks of silk ties and velvet jackets until I reached a private fitting lounge. There he was, Andre. He was standing on a circular velvet pedestal surrounded by 3 of his groomsmen. He was holding a crystal glass of champagne in one hand, while a tailor carefully adjusted the hem of his dark navy tuxedo trousers. He looked incredibly handsome. He had my shoulders and his mother's smile. But as he laughed at a joke one of his friends made, I realized I did not recognize the man standing on that pedestal. I stood quietly in the doorway until one of the groomsmen noticed me. The young man cleared his throat and nudged Andre. Andre turned around, a wide, arrogant smile on his face, ready to greet whoever had just walked in. When he saw me, the smile vanished instantly. The color drained from his cheeks. He almost dropped his champagne glass. "Dad," Andre said, his voice cracking slightly. "What are you doing here?" I kept my expression entirely neutral. "I need a word with you, Andre," I said quietly. "Just you and me. 5 minutes." The groomsmen exchanged awkward glances. Andre swallowed hard, stepped down from the pedestal, and handed his glass to the nearest friend. He whispered something to the tailor and walked toward me. He led me into a small private waiting area near the back exit of the shop. He closed the heavy wooden door behind us, cutting off the music and the laughter from the main room. As soon as the door clicked shut, Andre went on the offensive. This was a classic defensive tactic I had seen 1,000 times during my years dealing with dishonest contractors. "Dad, why are you showing up here unannounced?" Andre snapped. keeping his voice in a harsh whisper. "This is a private fitting for the wedding party. You are embarrassing me in front of my friends. And why are you wearing a suit? You look ridiculous." I ignored his insult. I looked him dead in the eyes, searching for any trace of guilt or remorse. "I went to the bank this morning to pay the electric bill," I said, slowly measuring every single word. I opened the application on my tablet. "The joint account is completely empty. The balance is zero. $85,000 is gone." Andre shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He broke eye contact and looked down at his expensive leather shoes. I waited for the confession. I waited for him to say he was sorry that the wedding expenses had gotten out of control, that Chloe had pressured him into it. I would have accepted almost any excuse if it came with genuine remorse. Instead, he looked back up at me and he lied right to my face. "I do not know what you are talking about, Dad," Andre said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "You probably just looked at the wrong account. You know you are not very good with technology. I will come over next week and help you sort it out." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The lie was so smooth, so practiced. "Chloe called me this morning," I continued, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "She told me she took the money to pay for the Grand Magnolia estate. She also told me the house was sold. She told me to pack my bags." Andre rolled his eyes and let out a frustrated sigh, acting as if I was a stubborn child who refused to understand a simple concept. "Dad, Chloe was just being dramatic," he said smoothly. "She is stressed out about the wedding tomorrow. You know how brides get. You misunderstood her. The money for this wedding is coming straight from Chloe's parents. They are incredibly wealthy, Dad. They are very generous people. They are paying for everything because they want their daughter to have the best. We did not touch your little retirement fund." He called my life savings a little retirement fund. He was standing there in a $3,000 tuxedo paid for with money he stole from me, praising the generosity of a family that had not contributed a single dime. "And the house?" I asked. "Did I misunderstand that too?" Andre crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Dad, we talked about the house months ago, remember? Your memory is really slipping lately. We agreed that the house is too big for you to maintain by yourself. We found a nice buyer. We are going to use the money to set you up in a really nice senior living community where you will have nurses to check on you. It is for your own good. You just forgot about the conversation." Gaslighting. My own son was trying to convince me that I was losing my mind to cover up his crimes. He had signed a forged power of attorney declaring me mentally incompetent, and now he was trying to play the part in real life. He was treating me like an obstacle to be managed, a burden to be discarded. I took a step closer to him. I dropped the calm facade just a fraction, letting a hint of the steel underneath show through. "Andre, I am going to ask you one final time," I said, my voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that used to make him stand at attention when he was a boy. "And I want you to listen to me very carefully. Your answer right now will determine the entire rest of your life. Did you forge my signature? Did you steal my money?" For a brief second, I saw a flash of pure panic in his eyes. He knew he was caught. He knew I was not confused, but instead of breaking down, the panic morphed into ugly defensive anger. He puffed up his chest, trying to physically intimidate a man who had spent 20 years hauling steel on the railway. "Look, old man," Andre sneered, completely dropping the loving son act. "I am done playing these games with you. You have never supported my relationship with Chloe. You have always been jealous of the life we are trying to build. You sit in that dusty house, living like a pauper, hoarding money you do not even know how to spend. Chloe and I deserve this. We have a future. You are just living in the past." He pointed a finger at my chest. "Go home," Andre commanded. "Pack your bags like Chloe told you, and do not even think about showing up at the Grand Magnolia tomorrow. You are not welcome there. My future in-laws will be there, and I will not have you wandering around looking confused and ruining my perfect day. Just stay out of Chloe's way." He turned his back on me and reached for the door handle. I stood there in the quiet room for a moment. The last thread of hope I had been holding on to snapped. It did not break with a loud noise. It just dissolved into nothing. The boy I had raised was dead. The man standing in front of me was a traitor. He was a thief, a liar, and a coward who hid behind a vicious woman. He had made his choice. He had looked at the man who gave him life, the man who paid for his education, the man who loved him unconditionally, and decided I was nothing more than an ATM to be smashed open and thrown away. I did not yell, I did not argue, I just buttoned my suit jacket. "Have a good fitting, Andre," I said softly to his back. "I will see you tomorrow." He scoffed, opening the door to the showroom. "I told you not to come, Dad." I walked past him without another word. I walked through the showroom, out the heavy glass doors, and back into the Atlanta heat. As I got into my car, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. The hesitation was gone. The guilt of what I was about to do to my own flesh and blood evaporated completely. Andre told me to stay out of Chloe's way. He told me not to ruin his perfect day. I pulled out my phone and sent a text message to my lawyer, Jonathan. The text read, "Proceed with the total liquidation. Contact the district attorney. We move at noon tomorrow." I put the car in drive. The gloves were officially off. I was not just going to stop the wedding. I was going to burn their entire fake world to the ground, and I was going to make sure they watched every single second of it. I walked out of the boutique and stepped back into the sweltering Atlanta heat. The air was thick and heavy, but I felt absolutely nothing. The last shred of paternal weakness had been completely burned out of my chest. Andre had made his choice. He had looked me dead in the eye and told me to stay out of the way. He had chosen a woman who stole my life savings over the father who had given him everything. I got into my car and locked the doors. The quiet interior of the vehicle was my sanctuary. It was time to stop playing the role of the disappointed father and start acting like the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I pulled out my phone and dialed Jonathan. The line connected almost instantly. My lawyer was waiting for my command. I told Jonathan that the conversation with my son was over. There would be no reconciliation. I told him to move forward with the total liquidation of their future. My first target was the wedding venue itself. Chloe had practically shoved the name of the place in my face during her gloating phone call that morning. The Grand Magnolia. It was one of the most exclusive and ridiculously expensive private estates in all of Atlanta. It was the kind of place where old money families hosted events that ended up in high society magazines. I needed to know everything about it. I told Jonathan to dig into their corporate structure, their ownership, and their financial health. I wanted to know where they banked and who held their mortgages. Jonathan asked for 20 minutes. I told him he had 10. I sat in my parked car and watched the wealthy patrons of Buckhead walk past my windshield. They were carrying shopping bags that cost more than what a railway mechanic made in a month. I used to look at people like them and wonder what it felt like to have that kind of power. Now I knew. Real power was not wearing a $3,000 suit or carrying a designer bag. Real power was sitting quietly in an unmarked car, holding the ability to bankrupt someone with a single phone call. I had spent decades building that power dollar by dollar, property by property. I had kept it a secret from Andre because I wanted him to earn his own way in the world. Instead, my silence had made him arrogant. He thought my frugality was poverty. He thought my quiet life was a sign of weakness. Tomorrow he would learn the difference between being quiet and being harmless. My phone vibrated against the leather console. It was Jonathan. I answered the call and listened as my lawyer delivered exactly what I paid him for. Jonathan told me that the Grand Magnolia estate was a beautiful property on the surface, but a financial disaster behind closed doors. The family that owned the estate had over-leveraged the property years ago. They had taken out massive commercial loans to renovate the grounds, hoping to attract celebrity weddings. But the market had shifted and their bookings had dropped. According to the private banking records Jonathan had accessed through his firm, the Grand Magnolia was currently $3 million in debt. They were 6 months behind on their primary mortgage payments. The commercial bank that held their loans was preparing to file for foreclosure by the end of the month. The owners were desperate. They were drowning. I smiled. Desperate people were incredibly easy to negotiate with. Jonathan also had an update on Chloe and her wedding contract. He had managed to get a contact inside the venue management office to pull the file for tomorrow. Chloe had signed a contract for $200,000. She had used the $85,000 she stole from my bank account to cover the initial deposit and the catering fees. But there was a catch. The contract clearly stated that the final payment of $50,000 had to be cleared by tomorrow morning before the first guest arrived. If the final payment was not processed, the venue had the right to lock the doors, cancel the event, and keep the deposit. Chloe was planning to use the money from the fraudulent sale of my house to cover that final $50,000. But she did not know that the money was locked in an escrow account controlled by my company. She did not know that her credit cards would be completely frozen by the fraud department. Tomorrow morning she would have $0 to her name. I gave Jonathan his instructions. I told him to contact the commercial bank holding the debt for the Grand Magnolia. I ordered him to buy the debt outright using the emergency cash reserves from Apex Holdings. I did not care if he had to pay a premium to rush the paperwork. I wanted Apex Holdings to be the sole owner of that $3 million loan by the end of the business day. I wanted the legal right to foreclose on the property whenever I saw fit. I wanted to be the landlord of the Grand Magnolia. Jonathan did not hesitate. He told me the bank would be thrilled to offload a toxic asset so quickly. He promised to have the digital signatures completed within the hour. I hung up the phone and started the engine. I drove through the city feeling a cold, calculating calm settle over my mind. The trap was set perfectly. Chloe thought she was going to have a fairy tale wedding. She thought she had outsmarted a pathetic old man. She was going to wake up tomorrow, put on her expensive white dress, and walk into a venue that I owned. She was going to stand on my property, eating food paid for by my stolen money, celebrating a marriage built on a foundation of lies. And when the time was right, I was going to pull the floor out from under her. 2 hours later, I was sitting at the kitchen table in my house. The same house Chloe claimed she had sold. My tablet chimed with an incoming email. It was from Jonathan. Attached was a highly confidential legal document. It was a transfer of debt ownership. Apex Holdings was now the primary creditor and functional owner of the Grand Magnolia estate. The venue belonged to me. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct office number for the venue manager. Jonathan had provided it in the email. The line rang 3 times before a man answered. He sounded stressed and exhausted. Grand Magnolia Estate. "This is Richard speaking," the man said. "Good afternoon, Richard," I said, keeping my voice low and authoritative. "My name is Solomon Pierce. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings. I believe your board of directors just received notice that my firm has acquired your outstanding commercial debt." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The arrogance of the luxury event planner vanished instantly. "Yes, sir," Richard stammered. "We just received the email from the bank. Mr. Pierce, I want to assure you that we are doing everything we can to increase our revenue. We have a massive event tomorrow that will bring in significant capital." "I know about the event tomorrow," I replied. "It is the wedding of Chloe and Andre Pierce." Richard paused, clearly confused by the shared last name. "Yes, sir," he said cautiously. "That is correct." "Listen to me very carefully, Richard," I told him. "I am going to give you a set of instructions. If you follow them exactly as I say, I will not only restructure your debt to keep your doors open, but I will authorize a massive renovation budget for your property next quarter. If you disobey me, or if you warn the bride about this conversation, I will foreclose on the property on Monday morning, and you will be out of a job. Do you understand me?" "I understand completely, Mr. Pierce," Richard said, his voice shaking. "Whatever you need, sir. Tomorrow morning the bride is going to attempt to pay her final $50,000 balance," I said. "Her credit cards will be declined. Her bank transfers will bounce. She is completely broke." Richard gasped. "But sir, our policy is to cancel the event immediately if the final balance is not cleared. We cannot afford to host a $200,000 wedding for free." "You are not hosting it for free," I snapped. "I am covering the cost personally. When her cards decline tomorrow, I want you to act panicked. I want you to let her sweat. But ultimately, I want you to tell her that you will allow the wedding to proceed and that you will deal with the billing on Monday. You are going to let her walk down that aisle. You are going to serve the food. You are going to pour the champagne. You are going to make sure every single guest is seated and comfortable." "But why?" Sir Richard asked, completely bewildered. "Because, Richard, I am the father of the groom," I said coldly. "And I want to be the one who shuts the wedding down. I will be arriving shortly after the ceremony begins. I will give you a signal. When I give that signal, I want you and your staff to be ready to cut the music, turn on the house lights, and lock the exit doors. No one leaves until I say so." There was a long silence on the line. Richard was realizing exactly what kind of family drama he was caught in the middle of, but he was a businessman. He knew exactly who signed his paychecks now. "It will be done exactly as you say, Mr. Pierce," Richard agreed. "We will proceed as normal until you arrive." I hung up the phone and looked out the window at my backyard. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the grass. The board was set. The pieces were in motion. Chloe had stolen my money to buy a kingdom for a day. She did not realize I had just bought the entire kingdom permanently. Tomorrow she was going to learn what happens when you try to ruin a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to use against you. Tomorrow, I was going to teach them both a lesson in ultimate destruction. After hanging up with Richard, the venue manager, I realized I needed one more piece of the puzzle. I called him back and told him to email me the master vendor list for the wedding tomorrow. I needed the names and physical addresses of every business Chloe had hired to put together her luxurious dream day. Richard sent the document to my tablet within 2 minutes. I opened the file and scanned the list. Chloe had spared absolutely no expense. She had hired a premier catering company, a luxury florist, and an award-winning photography studio. I looked at the clock. It was late afternoon. I had just enough time to make 3 personal house calls before the sun went down. I drove to the main branch of my bank one last time. I bypassed the tellers and went straight to the private wealth management vault. I made a massive cash withdrawal from my own personal reserves. I packed the thick, heavy stacks of crisp $100 bills into a black leather briefcase. My first stop was an upscale culinary studio located in the trendy arts district. It was owned by a man named Chef Julian. According to the contract, Chloe had hired him to cater a lavish 5-course meal for 200 guests. I walked into the sleek stainless steel commercial kitchen and asked to speak with the owner. Julian came out from the back room wiping his hands on a white apron. I introduced myself politely as Andre's father. Julian immediately relaxed and smiled. He started bragging about the imported truffles and the premium Wagyu beef Chloe had demanded for the main course. I let him talk for a minute before I opened my briefcase and placed a stack of federal court documents on his prep table. I told him to look at the paperwork. Julian read the papers. His arrogant smile vanished. The color drained from his face. I explained to him that the money Chloe used to pay his deposit was frozen in an active federal wire fraud investigation. I told him that her credit card would be completely declined early tomorrow morning. Julian panicked. He stammered his business would be ruined. I opened my briefcase to reveal the cash. I told Julian I would pay him the remaining $20,000 now. But there was a condition. I told him to prepare the food exactly as ordered. I wanted the smell of that Wagyu beef to fill the venue. But when the time came for the dinner service, he was not going to serve a single plate. I told him that when I gave the signal, he and his waitstaff were to walk out, pack the food, and leave. Julian nodded slowly and took the money. My next stop was a floral warehouse on the edge of the city. The florist was a woman named Maria who was locally famous for creating towering floral arches. I found her directing a team of workers loading expensive white roses into delivery vans. I approached her and went through the exact same process. I introduced myself, showed her the fraud investigation documents, and explained the grim reality of her financial situation. I told her she would never see the final $15,000 Chloe owed her. Maria was absolutely furious. She said she imported rare orchids directly from South America just for this bride. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out $15,000 in cash. I handed the thick stacks of bills directly to Maria. I told her I was buying the flowers myself. I instructed her to set up the most beautiful floral display at the Grand Magnolia tomorrow. I wanted Chloe to walk down the aisle surrounded by absolute perfection, but I also told Maria that she and her crew needed to stay hidden on site during the ceremony. I told her when I stood up and gave the signal she was to instruct her team to march into the room and tear down every single arch. I wanted them to strip the tables bare and take back every last petal right in front of the shocked guests. Maria smiled a very wide smile. She took the cash and admitted she hated dealing with Chloe anyway. The last stop was a photography and videography studio downtown. The photographer was a young guy named Marcus. Marcus was editing photos on a large monitor setup when I walked in. I did not bother with any friendly small talk. I placed the legal paperwork right on his desk, proving his client was broke and under federal investigation. Marcus groaned loudly and rubbed his face in frustration. He said high-end weddings were his livelihood and a canceled gig at the last minute meant he could not pay his studio rent for the month. I placed $10,000 in cash directly onto his computer keyboard. I told Marcus that the wedding was definitely not canceled. I told him to show up tomorrow with every single camera lens and drone he owned. I instructed him to capture all the beautiful typical moments, the expensive dress, the fake smiles, the walk down the aisle. But my most important instruction was about what happened next. I told Marcus that when the ceremony was abruptly interrupted and the police sirens started wailing outside, he was not allowed to stop filming under any circumstances. I wanted him to push right into the chaos. I wanted him to capture the look of total devastation on Chloe's face. I wanted high-definition footage of my traitorous son realizing his perfect life was over. I paid him to document the exact moment their fake empire crumbled. Marcus pocketed the money and swore he would not miss a second. I walked out of the photography studio and got back into my car. The sun was finally dipping below the Atlanta skyline. I had bought the venue, I had bought the caterer, I had bought the florist and the photographer. I legally controlled every single aspect of the fantasy world Chloe thought she was building. But there was still one detail missing before the trap could be fully sprung. I needed a recorded confession to guarantee a federal prison sentence, and I knew exactly where to get it. Tonight was the official rehearsal dinner. It was an intimate, expensive gathering at a fancy downtown restaurant for the wedding party and Chloe's wealthy parents. I was explicitly told by both my son and his fiancée earlier today that I was not welcome to attend. They wanted to hide me away so I would not embarrass them in front of their high-class guests. I started the engine and checked the address of the restaurant on my phone. I was not going to dress up. I was not going to cause a loud scene. I wanted to watch them. I was just going to walk in with my phone recording and let them show their true horrible colors to the world. I smiled and pulled my car into the heavy evening traffic. It was time to go crash a private party and collect the final nail for their coffin. The evening air in Atlanta was heavy and warm as I drove toward the downtown dining district. I knew exactly what kind of people I was dealing with tonight. They judged everyone by the price tag on their clothing and the luxury brand on their vehicle. I was not wearing my custom-tailored charcoal suit anymore. For this specific occasion, I needed to look exactly like the man they thought I was. I put on my faded denim jeans, a plain cotton shirt, and the scuffed leather boots I used to wear when I worked at the railway yard. I wanted to look like an old, tired man who had nothing left to lose. I parked my car a block away from the restaurant. It was a famous French bistro known for its exclusive guest list and absurdly priced menu. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the voice recording application and pressed the red button. I locked the screen and slipped the phone into my breast pocket, making sure the microphone was exposed just enough to pick up every single word. I was about to walk into a room full of wolves, but I was the only one bringing a trap. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant. The hostess immediately stepped in front of me with a tight, uncomfortable smile. She looked at my worn clothes and assumed I was a lost vagrant asking for directions. I told her I was there for the rehearsal dinner hosted by the Pierce family. The young hostess hesitated, looking me up and down, but eventually led me toward the back of the restaurant. They had rented out the entire private dining room. The room was dripping in crystal chandeliers and expensive floral arrangements. The guests were dressed in designer evening wear, sipping imported champagne and laughing loudly. At the head table sat my son Andre and his fiancée Chloe. Next to them sat a distinguished-looking white couple who could only be the parents of Chloe. I stood in the doorway for a moment just watching them. Andre looked nervous, sipping his drink too fast. Chloe looked radiant and completely smug. I took a deep breath and stepped fully into the room. The conversations around the tables began to die down as people noticed me. The silence spread like a wave until the entire room was completely quiet. Everyone was staring at the old black man in the faded clothes who had just crashed their expensive party. Andre saw me standing there and his face went completely pale instantly. He whispered something to Chloe. Chloe turned around and her smile instantly vanished. She stood up abruptly from the table, her face flushed with anger. Her parents looked at me with expressions of pure disgust, as if a stray dog had just wandered into their pristine dining room. I walked very slowly toward the large head table, keeping my posture slightly hunched to play the part of the defeated father. I could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on me, but it only made me feel more powerful. Chloe marched up to me before I could even reach the table. "What are you doing here, Solomon?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so the other guests could not hear. "We had specifically told you not to come to this dinner. You are ruining everything." I looked past her and locked eyes with her father. He was a tall man with silver hair and a custom-tailored suit. He stood up slowly and walked right over to us, standing very protectively next to his daughter. "I assume this is the father you were telling us about, Chloe," the man said, looking me up and down with obvious contempt. "My name is Charles. I would gladly shake your hand, but it looks like you just came from a filthy construction site." His wife Evelyn joined them, holding a glass of wine. She let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Oh, Charles, be nice," she said. "Not everyone had the opportunity to get a proper education and build a successful life. Some unfortunate people just have to settle for the very bottom of the barrel. I quietly stood there and let them insult me. I let them pour their arrogance all over me. It was exactly what I wanted. I looked at Andre, who was still sitting at the table, refusing to make eye contact with me. "Your son told us all about your little situation," Solomon Charles said, taking a sip of his drink. "He told us how you have been struggling to maintain that old house of yours. It is a terrible shame, really. A man works his whole life doing manual labor and ends up with absolutely nothing to show for it. But do not worry about Andre anymore. We are bringing him into our family now. We are going to teach him how real business is done. We are going to show him how to live in the modern world. You can just go back to your quiet little life and let us handle his future." Evelyn chimed in again. "Frankly, Solomon," she said, waving her hand dismissively, "I am shocked you even showed up here wearing those cheap clothes. Do you not have any respect for your son? You look exactly like a homeless beggar. It is incredibly embarrassing for Chloe to have her friends see you like this." Chloe laughed right along with her mother. She pointed at my scuffed leather boots and my faded jeans. "Look at him," Mother Chloe said loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "He cannot even afford a decent suit for his own son to be proud of. This is exactly why we did not invite him. He simply does not belong in our world. He is just a broke old man who wants to drag Andre down into his miserable poverty." I deliberately forced my own hands to tremble slightly. I looked down at the floor, acting as if their words were tearing me apart. "I just wanted to see my son," I said, my voice cracking perfectly. "I just wanted to ask you about my money." Chloe sighed heavily and crossed her arms over her chest. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Solomon," she snapped. "Are you still going on about that bank account? I told you this morning it is our money now. We need it to start our life. You are old and you do not need it. What are you going to do with $85,000 anyway? Buy yourself more ugly, cheap flannel shirts." The guests chuckled quietly at her cruel joke. I looked at Chloe, keeping my eyes wide and pathetic. "But you sold my house," I said loudly enough for the microphone in my pocket to catch every syllable. "You forged my name on a power of attorney. How could you do that?" Chloe laughed right in my face, completely unaware of the trap she was walking into. "I did not forge anything, you crazy old man," she said, her voice dripping with venom and pride. "We had a notary sign off on your mental incompetence. It was incredibly easy. Nobody questions a wealthy young couple taking control of a senile man. We sold that house because we deserve the equity more than you do. So yes, I took your money. Yes, I sold your house. We took what we deserve from the old man, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. Now get out of my party before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I stopped trembling. I stood straight, dropping the hunched posture immediately. The sudden shift in my demeanor caused Charles and Evelyn to take a step back in confusion. The pathetic, broken old man vanished, and the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings took his place. I looked directly into Chloe's eyes and smiled a cold, terrifying smile. I patted my breast pocket gently. "You are absolutely right, Chloe," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I cannot do anything tonight. Enjoy your expensive dinner, because tomorrow is going to be a very big day for all of us." I turned my back on them and walked out of the silent dining room with my head held high. I walked past the shocked hostess and stepped out into the warm Atlanta night. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and pressed the stop button on the recording application. The audio file was perfectly clear. I got into my car and locked the doors. I played the audio file back through my stereo system. Hearing her admit to federal wire fraud and elder abuse in such a clear, arrogant tone was like listening to the sweetest symphony. I had the confession. The federal evidence was secured. The trap was fully loaded and the timer was counting down. All I had to do now was go home, get some rest, and prepare for the greatest performance of my life. Tomorrow they would learn that the old man they despised had enough power to erase their entire existence with a single command. The drive away from the downtown restaurant felt completely different than the drive there. The heavy burden of doubt was completely gone from my tired shoulders. I was no longer a grieving father hoping to find a shred of decency in his only son. I was a man with a singular mission of absolute justice. The audio recording safely stored on my mobile phone was the final weapon I truly needed. Hearing Chloe admit to her crimes with such arrogant pride was sickening, but it was also the key to her absolute destruction. I navigated through the quiet city streets. I was not heading back to my empty house just yet. There was one final meeting that had to take place tonight before I could finally rest. I pulled my car onto the highway and headed toward the wealthy northern suburbs. I was going to visit an old friend named Desmond. Desmond and I went way back to our very early days working at the railway yard, while I was saving my money to buy commercial real estate. Desmond was studying law in the evenings. Today he was the most feared and respected district attorney in the entire home state. I parked my car in the wide circular driveway of his beautiful brick home. It was nearly midnight, but I could see the warm yellow light shining from the window of his private study. Desmond was a man who rarely slept. I walked up the front steps and rang the doorbell. A few short moments later, the heavy oak door swung open. Desmond stood there wearing a loose, warm sweater and reading glasses. He looked surprised to see me standing on his porch at such a late hour, but he immediately stepped aside and warmly invited me into his home. We walked down the long hallway and entered his study. The walls were completely covered in thick law books and framed legal certificates. Desmond walked over to a small wooden cabinet and poured 2 glasses of fine aged bourbon. He handed me a glass and sat down in a large leather armchair across from me. He asked me what was wrong because he knew I would never show up unannounced unless it was an absolute emergency. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, feeling the burn in my chest. I told him that I needed a massive legal favor. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out the folded documents. I placed the forged power of attorney and the printed bank statements directly onto his polished wooden desk. Desmond put on his reading glasses and picked up the papers. The room was completely silent as his trained eyes scanned the legal jargon and the financial transaction records. I watched his expression change from mild curiosity to deep professional concern. He looked at the signature on the bottom of the power of attorney document and frowned. He knew my handwriting perfectly well after all these years. "This is a very clumsy forgery," Desmond said quietly, tapping the paper with his index finger. "Someone drained your entire joint checking account and used this fraudulent document to sell your primary residence. Who did this, Solomon?" I looked him dead in the eye and told him it was my son Andre and his future wife Chloe. Desmond leaned back in his leather chair, letting out a heavy sigh of disbelief. He had known Andre since he was a little boy playing in my backyard. The betrayal hit him hard too, but he needed more proof to build a case. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the audio file I had recorded just an hour ago at the restaurant. I placed the phone on the desk and pressed play. The crystal-clear voices of Chloe and her arrogant parents filled the quiet study. Desmond listened intently as Chloe laughed and openly admitted to forging my name, stealing my money, and selling my house because she felt she deserved it more. He heard her mock my supposed poverty and threatened to call the police on me. When the recording finished, I turned the phone off. Desmond took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. The look on his face was one of pure judicial fury. He stood up and began pacing the floor of his study. "Solomon," he said, his voice thick with anger, "this is a textbook case of federal wire fraud and severe elder financial abuse. She admitted to everything on tape. They fabricated a medical condition to strip you of your legal rights. That carries a mandatory prison sentence. But we need to act fast before they try to move the money again or flee the jurisdiction after the wedding ceremony." I told him there was no need to worry about the money. I explained how the house was secretly sold to my holding company and how the stolen cash was frozen in an escrow account I controlled. Desmond stopped pacing and stared at me in absolute shock. A slow, bright smile spread across his face as he realized the sheer magnitude of the trap I built. "You bought the venue too?" he asked, laughing in disbelief. I nodded slowly, confirming his suspicion. "Now I just need the criminal warrants," I told him. "I want them arrested in their formal wear." Desmond walked over to his large wooden desk and opened his laptop. He told me that as the district attorney, he had the authority to request emergency warrants from a night court judge, especially in cases involving the financial exploitation of a senior citizen. He began typing furiously, drafting the legal documents right there in his study. He listed multiple felony charges, including identity theft, criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and the unlawful exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Every single keystroke was another heavy nail in the coffin they had built for themselves. I sat quietly and finished my aged bourbon. Within an hour, the digital paperwork was complete. Desmond made a secure phone call to a federal judge he knew well. He explained the situation and transmitted the audio file along with the forged documents. The judge was absolutely disgusted by the evidence and digitally signed the arrest warrants immediately. Desmond closed his laptop and looked at me. "The warrants are fully active, Solomon," he said. I can have a police cruiser sent to their hotel right now to pick them up before the sun even rises. We can end this nightmare tonight and you can go back to sleep." I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied, my voice completely calm and resolved. "I do not want them arrested in the privacy of their hotel room. They humiliated me in front of their wealthy friends tonight. They planned to throw me out onto the street while they celebrated their union. I want this to happen at the wedding venue tomorrow. I want them to stand in front of everyone they tried to impress and lose everything." Desmond smiled and agreed. He promised to have officers waiting outside the estate tomorrow. They would hold their positions until my secret signal. The sun slowly rose over the city of Atlanta, bringing with it the promise of a beautiful day. The sky was a perfect clear blue and the air was crisp. At the Grand Magnolia estate, the morning was already in full swing. The massive iron gates were wide open, welcoming a fleet of delivery vans and luxury vehicles. Inside the main ballroom, Maria and her team of florists were busy constructing the towering white floral arches that I had paid for the day before. In the massive commercial kitchen, Chef Julian was carefully preparing the Wagyu beef and imported truffles. Every single detail was absolutely flawless. It looked exactly like the $200,000 dream wedding Chloe had always wanted. She was currently sitting in the master bridal suite on the second floor of the estate. The room was dripping in luxury with plush velvet seating and antique mirrors. Chloe was sitting in a tall leather chair wearing a custom silk robe with her future initials embroidered on the back. She was holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne while two professional makeup artists hovered around her face. Her bridesmaids were lounging on the sofas, sipping their own drinks and laughing loudly at inside jokes. Chloe looked at her reflection in the mirror and smiled a deep, satisfied smile. In her mind, she had orchestrated the perfect crime and the perfect wedding. She had successfully stolen my life savings, she had sold my home, and she had completely banished me from her perfect high society life. She thought she was the smartest person in the entire world. She had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath her feet was already crumbling and that the financial guillotine was inches from her neck. The heavy wooden door of the bridal suite slowly opened. A young woman named Jessica walked into the room. Jessica was the luxury wedding planner Chloe had hired months ago. Normally, Jessica was a picture of calm, professional grace, but this morning she looked pale and completely terrified. She was clutching a digital tablet tightly against her chest, and her eyes were darting nervously around the room. She walked over to the makeup chair and cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, Chloe," Jessica said, her voice trembling just a little bit. "I am so sorry to interrupt your makeup session, but I really need to speak with you in private for a moment. It is about the final venue payment." Chloe rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic sigh of annoyance. She did not even bother to look away from the mirror. "There is no need for privacy, Jessica," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "These are my best friends. We have absolutely no secrets from each other. Just tell me what the problem is so I can get back to enjoying my special morning." Jessica swallowed hard and took a step closer. The bridesmaids stopped laughing and looked over. "Chloe, I just came from the main management office," Jessica explained. "Richard, the venue manager, tried to process your final $50,000 payment this morning exactly as outlined in your contract, but the transaction did not go through. Your credit card was declined." Chloe let out a sharp, condescending laugh. She took another sip of her champagne and shook her head. "That is ridiculous," she said confidently. "It is probably just a security hold because it is such a large transaction. My bank is very protective of my wealth. Just run the card again." Jessica did not smile. She looked even more uncomfortable. "We did run the card again, Chloe," she said quietly. "We ran it 3 times. The bank system returned a hard decline every single time. And then Richard tried to process the backup wire transfer you set up using the funds from the real estate sale. The bank system rejected that transfer as well. The automated message stated that the account has been completely frozen pending a federal investigation." Chloe finally stopped looking at her reflection. She lowered her champagne glass and turned her head to look at the wedding planner. A flicker of genuine panic crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with anger. "Give me my phone," she snapped at one of her bridesmaids. The bridesmaid quickly handed over the expensive smartphone. Chloe unlocked the screen and opened her mobile banking application. She navigated to the joint account she shared with Andre, the account where she had stashed all of my stolen retirement money. The screen loaded and displayed a bright red warning banner. The available balance was $0. She frantically tapped the screen and opened the escrow account where the money from the fraudulent house sale was supposed to be waiting. Another red banner appeared. The funds were locked and completely inaccessible. The screen displayed a harsh legal message citing suspected wire fraud and unauthorized asset transfer. Her heart began to pound heavily against her ribs. The $85,000 she stole from me was gone. The nearly $400,000 from the house sale was frozen. She was sitting in a bridal suite that cost thousands of dollars a night, and she did not have a single penny to her name. Her entire financial world was collapsing right in front of her eyes. The bridesmaids exchanged confused and worried glances. Jessica shifted her weight nervously. "Richard needs the payment cleared immediately. Chloe." Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said if the balance is not settled before the first guest arrives, he will be forced to lock the doors and cancel the entire event." Chloe gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could not cancel the wedding. Her wealthy parents were waiting downstairs. 200 of her snobby high society friends were currently driving to the estate expecting a royal celebration. If the wedding was canceled because she was broke, her reputation would be permanently destroyed. She would be the laughingstock of her entire social circle. She forced a wide smile onto her face. "It is just a stupid bank error," she lied smoothly, handing the phone back to her bridesmaid. "My accounts are perfectly fine. Tell Richard to proceed with the setup, Jessica. I am a Montgomery and we do not cancel weddings over simple computer glitches. I will deal with the bank on Monday morning, and I will personally write Richard a check when the ceremony is over. If he tries to stop my wedding, I will ruin his career and sue this estate into bankruptcy." Jessica looked terrified, but she nodded slowly. She promised to deliver the message and quickly left the room. Chloe turned back to the mirror and told the makeup artist to finish their work. She was terrified, but her arrogance was far stronger than her fear. She assumed she could just bully her way through the day and force the vendors to wait for their money. She thought she was still in control. She did not realize that I was the one who authorized Richard to let the wedding proceed, and that she was simply marching straight into my very carefully laid trap. The sun was shining brightly over the Grand Magnolia estate as the first wave of luxury vehicles began to pull through the massive iron gates. Valet drivers in crisp white uniforms rushed to open doors for the wealthy guests, who stepped out wearing designer dresses and expensive tailored suits. The atmosphere was filled with the sounds of classical music and the cheerful chatter of high society elites. Everyone who considered themselves important in Atlanta had gathered on my property to celebrate a marriage built entirely on lies and stolen money. It was a beautiful day for absolute destruction. The venue looked absolutely breathtaking from the outside. Maria and her dedicated floral team had followed my instructions perfectly. Towering arches of rare white orchids and imported roses lined the main walkway leading up to the grand ballroom. The sweet fragrance of the expensive flowers mixed with the rich, mouth-watering aroma of roasted Wagyu beef drifting from the commercial kitchen where Chef Julian was preparing the extravagant feast. Marcus, the photographer, was already flying his drone overhead, capturing every single moment of the luxurious event in high definition. Chloe had spared absolutely no expense with my stolen funds. I parked my vehicle in a reserved space near the back entrance. It was a sleek black luxury sedan that I rarely ever drove, preferring to keep my immense wealth hidden from the greedy eyes of the world. I turned off the powerful engine and took a long moment to look at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was not wearing faded denim jeans or scuffed leather work boots today. I was not the broken, pathetic old man they had laughed at during the rehearsal dinner last night. Today I was stepping fully into my true power. I was wearing a $5,000 bespoke suit tailored perfectly to my exact measurements. The charcoal gray fabric was imported directly from Italy, and the dark silk tie rested perfectly against my crisp white collar. I wore a vintage gold watch on my left wrist that cost more than my son made in an entire year. My leather dress shoes were polished to a brilliant mirror shine. I looked exactly like the wealthy, powerful chief executive officer of Apex Holdings that I truly was. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the grand entrance doors. I walked with my head held high, projecting an aura of absolute authority and calm control. As I stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the sheer massive scale of the ballroom revealed itself. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the neatly arranged rows of plush velvet chairs. A live string quartet was playing beautiful soft music in the corner of the room. I stood quietly at the very back of the room, simply watching the large crowd of arrogant socialites mingle and laugh while they waited for the ceremony to begin. It did not take long for someone to notice my unexpected presence. Charles and Evelyn, the snobby, wealthy parents of the bride, were standing near the front of the room holding tall crystal glasses of expensive champagne. Charles happened to casually glance toward the back doors, and his eyes locked directly onto mine. For a brief second, he did not even recognize me. My tall posture, my expensive clothing, and my entire dominating demeanor were completely different from the tired old railway worker he had viciously mocked and insulted at the expensive downtown restaurant the night before today. But when recognition finally dawned on his face, his expression instantly turned into a tight mask of pure outrage and disgust. He quickly whispered something into the ear of his wife and then immediately began marching down the center aisle toward me. Evelyn followed closely behind him, her face pinched with anger and superior contempt. They walked with heavy, aggressive steps, clearly intending to intimidate me and force me out of the building before I could cause a scene. I simply stood there with my hands clasped casually behind my back, waiting patiently for them to approach me. Chloe, who was standing near the front altar taking early photographs with Andre, noticed the sudden aggressive movement of her parents. She looked down the long aisle and saw me standing calmly at the back doors. Her eyes widened in absolute shock and immediate panic. She quickly gathered the heavy white silk fabric of her expensive custom wedding dress and hurried down the aisle toward me, leaving Andre standing completely alone at the altar, looking absolutely terrified. She looked like a furious white ghost gliding rapidly across the polished hardwood floor, desperate to protect her perfect fake world. Charles reached me first. He stopped just 2 feet away from me and puffed out his chest, trying to use his height and his expensive suit to intimidate me. "What in the world are you doing here, Solomon?" Charles demanded, his voice a harsh, angry whisper meant to keep the other guests from hearing the commotion. "We made it perfectly clear last night that you are absolutely not welcome here today. Did you seriously go out and rent a suit just to come here and embarrass your son in front of our friends and family? Leave right now." Evelyn stepped up right next to her husband and glared at me with pure hatred. "You have an incredible amount of nerve showing up at my daughter's wedding," she said, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "You need to turn around and leave this private property immediately before we have you arrested for trespassing." Chloe finally arrived, breathless and furious. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "I told you to stay away from me, you crazy old man," she hissed, her voice shaking with intense rage. "You are trying to ruin my perfect day. I do not care how you managed to sneak in here, but you are going to be thrown out right now," Chloe threatened. She turned her head and scanned the large room frantically. She spotted a large, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark black suit with a communication earpiece standing near the side exit. He was the head of security for the Grand Magnolia estate. "Security!" Chloe shouted, waving her arm frantically to get the attention of the large man. "Security, come over here immediately! We have an uninvited trespasser who is harassing the entire wedding party constantly. I want this man forcibly removed from the premises right this second," Chloe demanded loudly. The head of security immediately started walking toward us with a stern, highly professional expression on his face. Charles smirked at me and adjusted his silk tie confidently. "You brought this public humiliation upon yourself," Solomon Charles said arrogantly. "Now you are going to be dragged out of here like common trash." I did not move a single muscle. I did not say a word. I simply stood there and waited calmly as the large security guard approached our angry little group today. The security guard stopped, completely ignoring Chloe. He bowed deeply. "Welcome back, Mr. Pierce. The property is secure." Chloe stared in pure, terrified confusion. The head of security stood up straight and returned to his post, completely ignoring the furious demands of my future daughter-in-law. Chloe stood frozen in the center of the grand aisle, her mouth slightly open in absolute shock. Charles and Evelyn were equally paralyzed, staring at the security guard, and then back at me with expressions of pure bewilderment. They could not understand why the hired help of this magnificent estate was treating a man they considered to be a homeless beggar like royalty. I did not offer them a single word of explanation. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my bespoke suit and walked right past them. I moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who owned the very ground he walked on, because in this case I actually did. I walked past the rows of perfectly arranged velvet chairs, ignoring the whispers and the curious stares of the wealthy guests. I made my way to the very front of the room. I stopped at the first row right on the right side of the aisle. That was the traditional place of honor reserved exclusively for the parents of the groom. The seat was entirely empty. They had not even bothered to place a name card for me. I sat down, smoothing the fabric of my trousers, and crossed my legs comfortably. In my right hand I held a sleek black leather folder. It was not very thick, but the papers inside carried enough legal weight to completely crush the two people standing near the altar. Inside that folder were the printed copies of the forged power of attorney, the frozen bank account statements, the recorded confession transcripts, and the active federal arrest warrants signed by the night court judge. It was the ultimate instrument of their destruction. I rested the folder gently on my lap and looked up toward the front of the grand ballroom. My son Andre was standing at the altar. He was wearing his expensive custom tuxedo, looking like the perfect high society groom, but his confident facade was rapidly melting away. He had seen the entire interaction at the back doors. He had seen me walk down the aisle wearing a suit that cost more than his car, and he was currently staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. He was sweating profusely under the bright, warm lights of the crystal chandeliers. Andre shifted his weight nervously from foot to foot. He kept looking from me to the side exit and back to me again, as if he was contemplating running away before the ceremony even began. His groomsmen standing in a neat line behind him noticed his sudden panic and leaned in to whisper questions, but Andre ignored them. He was trapped. He knew that if he ran, he would have to explain to 200 wealthy guests and his future in-laws exactly why he was fleeing his own wedding. He chose to stay, hoping desperately that my presence in the front row was just a silent protest. He was silently praying that I would just sit there quietly and let him marry into the wealthy family he so desperately craved. He had absolutely no idea about the criminal warrants waiting outside or the fact that I now legally owned the building he was standing in. He just thought his poor old father had managed to scrape together enough money to buy a nice suit and sneak past the front gate. The soft ambient chatter in the grand ballroom slowly began to fade away as the string quartet smoothly transitioned into a new song. It was the traditional wedding march. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room closed and then slowly reopened to reveal the bridal party. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle first, wearing elegant dresses paid for by my stolen retirement funds. They held beautiful bouquets of imported flowers that I had personally funded just yesterday afternoon. Each woman smiled brightly for the photographer, completely oblivious to the massive storm gathering right in front of them. The photographer Marcus was moving smoothly through the room, capturing every angle just as I had instructed him to do. He caught my eye for a brief fraction of a second and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and he was making sure his high-definition cameras were perfectly positioned to record the incoming disaster. Then the music swelled to a dramatic crescendo, and the bride finally appeared. Chloe stood at the back of the long aisle holding the arm of her father, Charles. She was wearing a breathtaking white silk gown covered in delicate lace and sparkling crystals. It was a dress fit for a princess. But the expression on her face was anything but royal. Despite her heavy professional makeup, she looked extremely pale. Her eyes were darting nervously around the room, searching for any sign of a threat. She was terrified about her declined credit cards and the frozen escrow account. She was terrified about the bizarre interaction with the security guard. And most of all, she was terrified of me. As she began her slow walk down the long aisle, she tried her best to force a bright, happy smile for the cameras, but her lips were trembling. Every single step she took was heavily burdened by the crushing weight of her own arrogant lies. Charles walked beside her, looking stiff and uncomfortable. He kept shooting angry, sideways glances at the security personnel stationed around the room, wondering why they had refused his direct orders to throw me out. He was a man who was incredibly used to getting his own way simply by raising his voice and throwing his money around. Being ignored by the hired help was a completely foreign and infuriating experience for him. As they slowly made their way down the aisle, passing row after row of smiling, clapping guests, Charles and Chloe finally approached the front of the room. They had to walk directly past my seat. As Chloe passed me, I did not look away. I stared directly into her eyes. I did not glare or frown. I simply gave her a very small, incredibly calm smile. The kind of smile a predator gives right before the trap violently snaps shut. She quickly looked away, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Charles handed his daughter over to Andre at the altar. Charles turned around and glared at me one final time before taking his seat next to his wife, Evelyn. Andre took Chloe by both hands. His hands were visibly shaking. The officiant stepped up to the microphone and smiled warmly. "Welcome, family and friends." The officiant began, his voice echoing clearly. We are gathered here today to celebrate this union. I sat perfectly still listening. The tension in the room was suffocating. Andre kept glancing at the black folder. The officiant continued speaking about honesty and trust. Finally, he paused. He looked out over the quiet crowd. He took a deep breath and asked the final question. If anyone objects to this union, I prepared to stand up. The officiant let the question hang in the heavy air of the grand ballroom. If anyone objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence that followed was absolute. 200 wealthy guests held their collective breath, waiting for the traditional pause to end. Andre squeezed the hands of his bride so tightly her knuckles turned white. He stared straight ahead, sweating profusely. Charles and Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I sat perfectly still in the front row. I let 5 seconds pass to let the tension build to an unbearable breaking point before moving. Then I placed my hands firmly on my knees and stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate. Every single eye in the massive room snapped directly toward me. I smoothed the jacket of my bespoke charcoal suit and looked directly at the officiant. I object, I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried through the absolute silence of the ballroom like a crack of thunder. The reaction was instantaneous. A collective gasp echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Several women in the back rows covered their mouths in shock. The string quartet completely stopped playing their instruments now. The perfect high society wedding had just been shattered. Chloe dropped the hands of her groom and took a step back. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She pointed her trembling finger right at my face. "Get him out of here!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. Her voice echoed harshly off the vaulted ceilings, destroying the elegant atmosphere she had paid so much stolen money to create. "Security, drag this crazy old man out of my wedding right now." She looked wildly around the room, expecting the guards to rush toward me immediately, but the security personnel did not move a single muscle. The head of security stood quietly by the side door, watching the scene unfold with a blank, professional expression. Charles jumped up from his seat in the second row, his face flushed dark red with anger. "Are you completely deaf?" Charles yelled at the guards. "My daughter gave you a direct order to remove this trespasser. Remove him immediately or I will have all of you fired." The guards simply crossed their arms and remained perfectly still, following the direct orders of the man who actually owned the entire estate. Chloe realized the guards were not coming to save her. She turned her furious gaze back to me. "How dare you ruin my perfect day!" she cried, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. "You are nothing but a jealous, broke old man trying to destroy our happiness because you have nothing left in your pathetic life." Andre finally moved. The embarrassment of the situation pushed him past his fear. He let go of his bride and stepped down from the elevated altar. He marched down the short steps and walked directly toward me, closing the distance between us very rapidly. Andre stopped just inches from my face. He puffed out his chest and clenched his fists, trying to use his height and his youth to physically intimidate me. He wanted to look like a strong man protecting his new family, but I knew him better than anyone in the world. I could see the trembling in his hands and the absolute terror hiding behind his angry eyes. "You need to turn around and walk out those doors right now, Dad," Andre hissed through clenched teeth. "You have humiliated me enough for one lifetime. Leave before I make you leave today." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply looked up into the eyes of the boy I had raised. He thought he could bully an old railway worker into submission. He thought my silence over the years was a sign of weakness. I looked at his expensive custom tuxedo paid for with the money he stole from my retirement account. "You are not going to make me do anything, Andre," I said quietly, my voice dripping with cold authority. "You are going to stand there and listen to every single word I say now." Andre hesitated. The absolute certainty in my voice completely broke his aggressive facade. He took a tiny step backward, his confidence evaporating into the thick, tense air. Chloe marched down the steps to join him. She grabbed his arm and glared at me. "Do not listen to him, Andre," she commanded. "He is just trying to make a scene because he wants our money. Tell him to get out." The guests were murmuring loudly now. The entire ballroom was descending into total chaos. People were standing up in their seats trying to get a better view of the confrontation unfolding. Evelyn was loudly complaining to the wedding planner, demanding that the police be called immediately. The officiant stood frozen at the altar, completely unsure of what to do. I let the chaos swirl around me for a moment. I wanted them to feel the panic. I wanted them to realize that their carefully constructed world of lies was falling apart right in front of their wealthy friends. Then I slowly lifted the black leather folder I had been holding in my hand. I rested it calmly on the back of the empty chair directly in front of me right now. The simple motion of opening the folder seemed to draw the attention of the entire room. The murmuring slowly died down as 200 guests watched the wealthy-looking older man prepare to deliver his final blow. Chloe stared at the folder, her eyes widening with a sudden fresh wave of pure panic. She remembered the frozen bank accounts and the declined credit cards from that morning. She suddenly realized that my presence here was not just a bitter protest. She realized that I brought receipts. I flipped open the leather cover, revealing the thick stack of legal documents inside. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet air of absolute victory. I did not need a microphone. Decades of working in the noisy railway yards had given me a voice that could cut through heavy steel and loud engines. I projected my voice across the grand ballroom, commanding the room with the absolute authority of a king reclaiming his stolen throne. "My name is Solomon Pierce," I announced, my voice echoing powerfully off the high vaulted ceilings. "And I am here today to stop a crime from taking place on my own private property right now." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The guests stared in complete shock. Andre looked like he was going to be physically sick. Chloe let out a small, terrified gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. Charles and Evelyn stood frozen in the second row, their arrogant expressions completely wiped away. The trap was fully sprung, and there was absolutely nowhere for them to run. I looked down at the forged power of attorney resting on the top of the stack. It was time to show the entire world exactly what kind of monsters they truly were today. The entire grand ballroom was completely silent as I reached into the black leather folder. I pulled out the thick stack of papers I had meticulously prepared for this very moment. I did not rush my movements. I wanted the anticipation to burn through their veins. I stepped away from my chair and walked directly over to Charles and Evelyn. They were sitting in the second row, staring at me with a mixture of anger and confusion. I separated the first set of documents and dropped them right into the lap of Charles. I handed another set to Evelyn. Then I turned around and handed copies to the wealthy guests sitting in the front rows on both sides of the aisle. The rustling sound of thick paper echoed loudly in the quiet room. Charles looked down at the documents in his lap. He picked them up and adjusted his expensive glasses. I stood in the center of the aisle and turned to face the crowd. I spoke with a loud, clear voice, ensuring every single person in the massive room could hear my words perfectly. I told them to look at the first page of the packet. I explained that it was a general power of attorney document. I told the room that my son Andre and his beautiful bride Chloe had visited a local bank branch yesterday afternoon. I explained that they had presented this document to the bank manager, claiming that my mental health was rapidly declining. I told the guests that the document stated I was completely senile and entirely incapable of managing my own financial affairs. I paused and let those words sink into the minds of the wealthy socialites sitting in the velvet chairs. I told them to look at the signature at the very bottom of the page. I announced loudly that it was a complete forgery. I told them that I never signed away my rights and I was perfectly sane. I pointed directly at Chloe, who was standing at the altar. I told the room that the bride they were celebrating today had committed federal wire fraud to fund this lavish party. Charles flipped to the next page in the packet, his face turning pale. I continued my announcement. I told everyone to look at the second document. I explained that it was a certified bank statement from a joint checking account I shared with my son. I told them that the balance yesterday morning was $85,000. I told them that the money represented decades of my hard work and life savings. Then I told them to look at the current balance. I announced that the balance was $0. I explained that Chloe and Andre had authorized a massive wire transfer in the middle of the night. I told the crowd that every single penny of my retirement fund was stolen and wired directly to the management office of the Grand Magnolia estate. I told them that the expensive flowers they were admiring and the gourmet food they were waiting to eat were completely paid for with stolen money. The guests began to gasp and whisper furiously among themselves. Evelyn dropped her copy of the documents onto the floor as if the paper was physically burning her hands. She looked up at her daughter with an expression of pure horror. Charles stood up from his chair, clutching the bank statements. He looked at Andre and demanded to know if this was true. Andre could not even speak. He was physically trembling and staring at his shoes, completely unable to look his new father-in-law in the eye. His silence was the only confession Charles needed. The wealthy father of the bride turned red with absolute embarrassment and furious rage. He realized that his daughter was not marrying into a respectable family. He realized that she was a criminal, and she had dragged his prestigious family name right into the mud in front of 200 of their most important friends and business associates. The beautiful illusion of the perfect high society wedding was completely shattered and replaced by a disgusting crime scene. Chloe realized she was losing control of the entire narrative. She could see the disgust in the eyes of her parents and the wealthy guests. Her panic quickly morphed into a wild, hysterical rage. She stomped her foot on the elevated altar and screamed at the top of her lungs. She told everyone to stop reading the papers immediately. She screamed that I was a liar and a manipulative old man. She gripped the fabric of her expensive white wedding dress and marched down the steps of the altar. She walked right up to me, her face twisted with vicious anger. She told the entire room that she did absolutely nothing wrong. She proudly announced that she simply took control of a situation that needed to be handled. She screamed that Andre was legally on the bank account, and therefore the money belonged to them, just as much as it belonged to me. She told the guests that they deserved to have a beautiful wedding, and I was just being a selfish hoarder. She did not stop there. Her arrogance completely blinded her to the danger she was in. She pointed her finger directly at my chest and laughed a cruel, desperate laugh. She told the entire ballroom that I was just a pathetic, broke old man who could not accept reality. She screamed that she did not just take the cash from the bank account. She proudly admitted right there in front of 200 witnesses that she had also sold my house. She bragged about using a quick cash real estate agency to liquidate my primary residence behind my back. She told the crowd that the sale had already been finalized and the equity funds were securely transferred. She looked me right in the eyes and smiled with pure malicious intent. She told me that I had absolutely nothing left in the world. She said I was entirely homeless and completely destitute. She commanded me to leave the estate immediately because I was ruining the most expensive and important day of her entire life. The guests were absolutely horrified by her aggressive confession. Even Charles and Evelyn looked completely disgusted by the venom pouring out of their daughter. They had raised her to be a snobby socialite, but they never expected her to gleefully admit to stealing a house from an elderly man. The room was buzzing with shocked whispers and loud murmurs of strong disapproval. Chloe ignored them all. She stood tall, breathing heavily, believing that her aggressive confession had somehow proven her superiority. She thought that because she had successfully processed the real estate transaction, she was legally untouchable. She truly believed she had won the war, and that I was just throwing a desperate public tantrum before I was dragged away into poverty. She crossed her arms over her chest and waited for me to break down and cry. I did not cry. I did not show a single ounce of sorrow or defeat. I simply stood there and let her finish her hysterical screaming. I wanted her to feel the absolute peak of her false victory. I wanted her to firmly believe that she had successfully stolen my home and my money. I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my custom-tailored jacket. I pulled out one final piece of paper. It was not a bank statement or a forged power of attorney. It was a certified legal deed of ownership. I held the crisp white document in my right hand and looked directly into her angry eyes. The entire room fell completely silent once again, waiting to see what I was going to do next. I smiled, a very slow, cold, and calculated smile. The trap was completely closed, and it was time to drop the guillotine. I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice reached every single corner of the quiet ballroom. "You are absolutely right, Chloe," I said, my tone perfectly calm and steady. "You did sell my house yesterday afternoon. You forged my signature and you sold my 4-bedroom property to an anonymous commercial holding company. You thought you were so incredibly clever. You thought you were selling my home to a group of strangers who would kick me out onto the street. You thought you were walking away with hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure stolen equity." I paused and took a single step closer to her. Her arrogant smile began to falter just a fraction. I looked at Andre, who was still standing near the altar, looking like a condemned prisoner waiting for the executioner. I turned my attention back to the bride. "You made one massive, catastrophic mistake," I told her. I raised the legal document in my hand for everyone to see. I explained to the crowd that the holding company she sold my house to was called Apex Holdings. I told Chloe that she should have done her research before she tried to play real estate games with a man who had been in the business for 40 years. I watched the confusion wash over her face. She did not understand what I was saying yet. I took a deep breath and prepared to deliver the final absolute crushing blow. The moment had finally arrived. Everything I had planned since the moment I saw that $0 bank balance was leading to this exact second in time. I looked at the beautiful white flowers, the expensive crystal chandeliers, and the 200 wealthy guests who were hanging on to my every word. I looked at my traitorous son and his vicious bride. You sold my house to Apex Holdings, I repeated, my voice echoing with immense power. And you transferred the money into an escrow account. You thought you stole my home, but you did not steal anything. Because I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, you forged my name to sell my house directly back to my own company. And you wired the money into an escrow account that I completely control. You have absolutely $0, Chloe. But that is not even the best part of my surprise today. She stared at me in complete disbelief as the truth finally began to sink into her mind. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I leaned in close to her. And since we are talking about real estate, I said quietly but loud enough for the front rows to hear, I bought the commercial debt for this venue yesterday afternoon, so you are completely broke and you are currently trespassing on my private property. The grand ballroom was completely silent as my final words hung heavy in the warm air. I looked at the shocked faces of the wealthy guests sitting in the velvet chairs. I looked at my traitorous son who was trembling with absolute fear near the altar. I looked at the beautiful bride who was staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. She did not understand what I had just said. Her arrogant brain was completely unable to process the massive magnitude of her own failure. She was still desperately trying to hold onto the fragile illusion of her fake power. I decided to make it very simple for her. I let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed loudly off the crystal chandeliers and the vaulted ceilings. It was not a happy laugh, and it was certainly not a warm laugh. It was the cold, calculated laugh of a man who had just achieved absolute, total victory. The unexpected sound of my laughter sent a visible shiver down the spine of every single person in the room. Chloe took a step back, her expensive white wedding dress rustling loudly against the polished hardwood floor as she shook her head frantically. "You are lying," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and lingering rage. "You are just a broke railway worker. You do not own any companies, and you certainly do not own this expensive estate. You are just trying to trick me." I stopped laughing and stared directly into her eyes. My expression turned as hard and cold as solid steel. "I am not lying." "Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous low register, "I spent 20 years working hard on the railway, but I spent 30 years quietly building a massive real estate empire. I bought abandoned properties and turned them into highly profitable corporate centers. I created Apex Holdings to manage my massive wealth completely privately. I never told Andre about the true extent of my fortune because I wanted him to learn the value of hard, honest work. I wanted him to build his own life instead of lazily waiting around to inherit my money. But my silence only turned him into an entitled, greedy fool, and it made you believe that I was an easy target for your vicious financial crimes." I took another step closer to her shaking body now. I wanted her to feel the crushing weight of my authority. "You thought you were a criminal mastermind?" I continued, my voice projecting clearly across the silent ballroom. "You found a sleazy notary to forge my signature on a power of attorney. You hired a quick cash real estate agency to quietly sell my house behind my back. You thought the agency was just a random group of aggressive buyers. You did not do your research, Chloe. If you had bothered to look closely at the corporate paperwork, you would have realized the true identity of the real estate agency. That agency is just a small subsidiary completely owned and operated by Apex Holdings. The men in the tailored suits who came to measure my property were my own loyal employees. They flagged the fraudulent transaction immediately and reported it directly to my legal team. I could have stopped the sale right then and there. I could have called the police and had you arrested in your home before you even bought your expensive wedding dress. But I decided to let you dig your own grave a little bit deeper." The guests in the front rows gasped out loud now. The intricate layers of my trap were finally revealed to them. Charles and Evelyn were sitting frozen in their seats, looking at their daughter with absolute pure disgust. They were realizing that she was not just a thief, but a completely incompetent fool who had walked right into a massive snare. I pointed a finger directly at the face of the bride. "You forged my name to sell my house to my own company," I said, emphasizing every single word for maximum destructive impact. "You took my property and you willingly handed it right back to me this beautiful morning. And then you authorized the transfer of nearly $400,000 in equity into an escrow account. You thought that money was waiting for you to pay for your luxurious honeymoon and your expensive caterers. But that escrow account is managed directly by my corporate attorneys. I ordered them to freeze every single penny the moment the transfer cleared. "I control the account, Chloe. You do not have access to a single dime. You have absolutely $0 to your name today. The $85,000 you stole from my checking account is also frozen and completely inaccessible forever." Chloe began to breathe rapidly, her chest heaving in absolute panic. Her perfect makeup was starting to run as tears of genuine terror formed in her eyes. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her like a ton of heavy bricks. She was entirely broke. She had committed multiple federal felonies, and she had confessed to all of it in front of 200 witnesses. But I was not completely finished with her yet. I looked around the magnificent ballroom, admiring the towering floral arches and the sparkling crystal decorations before looking back at her pale face. I turned my attention back to the trembling bride, and by the way I added my voice echoing smoothly through the large room. "I own this venue too. I bought the outstanding commercial debt for the Grand Magnolia Estate yesterday afternoon. I am the sole legal owner of the ground you are standing on right now. You used my stolen money to pay the deposit to my management team. And when your final payment declined this morning, I personally ordered the manager to let you walk down the aisle anyway. I wanted you to put on your white silk dress. I wanted you to invite all your wealthy friends. I wanted you to experience the ultimate humiliation of losing absolutely everything right at the exact moment you thought you had finally won." The words struck her like a physical blow. Chloe let out a loud, agonizing wail. Her knees completely buckled beneath her, and she collapsed right onto the polished hardwood floor. The heavy white silk of her expensive wedding dress pooled around her trembling body like a deflated parachute. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably. Her arrogant fake empire was entirely destroyed forever. I looked over at Andre. My son was standing perfectly still, completely paralyzed with absolute fear. He was staring at me as if he was looking at a massive, terrifying stranger. He finally realized that the old man he had so casually betrayed was actually a titan of industry, with the power to erase his entire existence with a single phone call. He had sacrificed his only loving family for a woman who was now sobbing pathetically on the floor, completely ruined. The entire room watched in absolute stunned silence as the ultimate checkmate was finally delivered to them both. The magnificent grand ballroom remained completely motionless as my son and his bride absorbed the devastating reality of their situation. I stood tall at the front of the room watching Chloe sob pathetically on the polished hardwood floor. I had exposed her crimes and I had claimed my rightful ownership of the very ground she was kneeling on. But the punishment was not completely finished yet. I turned my head away from her and looked toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. Richard, the venue manager, was standing there waiting nervously. I raised my right hand and gave him a single sharp nod. That simple, silent gesture was the command that initiated the final phase of my absolute retribution. The heavy double doors leading to the massive commercial kitchen swung open immediately. Chef Julian marched out into the ballroom, followed by a long line of waitstaff wearing crisp white uniforms. They did not carry silver platters of gourmet food or trays of expensive champagne. Instead, they carried large plastic storage bins and heavy rolling carts. They moved with military precision, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the 200 wealthy guests sitting in the velvet chairs. They walked directly to the elaborate buffet stations and began blowing out the warming candles. The guests watched in absolute stunned silence as the catering staff began packing up the lavish feast. Chef Julian personally supervised the removal of the expensive imported Wagyu beef and the rare truffles. He instructed his team to seal the food in heavy plastic containers. The rich, mouth-watering aroma that had filled the ballroom just moments ago was quickly replaced by the sterile smell of cold metal and plastic. A waiter walked down the center aisle and began quietly collecting the crystal champagne glasses right out of the hands of the wealthy socialites. No one tried to stop him because they were too completely shocked to even speak. Just as the food was being rolled away, the side doors of the ballroom opened wide. Maria, the head florist, marched into the room leading a crew of 8 workers wearing heavy work boots and denim aprons. They were carrying large industrial trash bags and sharp metal clippers. They walked straight down the aisle, completely ignoring the sobbing bride on the floor. They approached the towering arches of white orchids and imported roses that framed the altar. Without a single moment of hesitation, Maria raised her clippers and sliced right through the thick green stems. The beautiful, expensive flowers tumbled down onto the polished floor. The sudden loud sound of the falling floral arrangements finally snapped Chloe out of her hysterical crying fit. She lifted her head and saw the workers tearing down her magnificent dream wedding. She scrambled to her feet, tripping over the heavy silk fabric of her custom dress. She ran toward the altar and threw herself in front of the workers. She held her arms out wide, desperately trying to protect the remaining flowers. She screamed at Maria, demanding that she stop destroying the decorations immediately. She told the florist that she had a legally binding contract and that she would sue her entire company into total bankruptcy. Maria did not even blink. She calmly lowered her clippers and looked the furious bride directly in the eyes. Maria spoke in a very clear, loud voice so the entire room could hear the humiliating truth. She told Chloe that her credit cards had been completely declined that morning. She explained that the funds for the final payment were frozen due to a federal wire fraud investigation. Maria pointed a finger directly at me. She told Chloe that the only reason she was even standing in this room today was because Mr. Pierce had personally paid her $15,000 in cash yesterday afternoon to set up the display. Maria continued her brutal explanation without any mercy. She stated firmly that she no longer worked for the bride or the groom. She told Chloe that she was now a direct employee of the property owner, and she only took her orders from Mr. Pierce. Chef Julian walked over and echoed the exact same sentiment. He told Chloe that his catering business was fully compensated by my private wealth and that he was instructed to pack up the food and leave. The vendors made it completely clear to the 200 wealthy guests that the bride was entirely broke and could not afford a single petal or plate. Chloe stumbled backward, completely defeated by the cold, hard truth. She looked at her parents sitting in the second row, begging them with her eyes to do something to save her perfect day. Charles and Evelyn stood up from their velvet chairs, but they did not walk toward their daughter. They were deeply embarrassed by the massive public humiliation. Charles walked over to Richard, the venue manager, and quietly asked if he could write a personal check to cover the remaining costs. Richard shook his head and politely informed the wealthy father that the event was officially canceled by the owner and no outside funds would be accepted today. The dismantling of the $200,000 wedding accelerated rapidly. The workers moved through the room with ruthless efficiency. They stripped the imported silk tablecloths off the round tables, leaving nothing but bare, cheap wood behind. The beautiful string quartet in the corner of the room quietly packed their expensive wooden instruments into velvet cases and walked out the back doors without playing another single note. The warm golden light from the crystal chandeliers was suddenly switched off, leaving the room illuminated only by the harsh, bright emergency lights on the ceiling. The luxurious grand ballroom was quickly transforming into a cold, empty, and very sterile warehouse space. Through all of this chaos, Marcus, the photographer, was still moving smoothly around the room. He was holding his high-definition camera steady, capturing every single second of the brutal dismantling. He walked right up to Chloe and pointed the heavy lens directly at her tear-stained face. She swatted frantically at the camera, demanding that he stop recording her humiliation. Marcus simply stepped back and reminded her that she was not paying his invoice anymore. He told her that he was hired by the new owner of the estate to document the entire event from start to finish. He continued to film her absolute total emotional breakdown. Andre stood completely alone near the altar, watching his entire future evaporate into thin air. He looked around the stripped-down ballroom, realizing that his greed had cost him everything. The wealthy guests began to stand up from their seats, whispering furiously as they gathered their expensive coats and bags. No one offered any words of comfort to the sobbing bride or the paralyzed groom. They simply wanted to escape the massive scandal unfolding right in front of them. I stood perfectly still in the center of the devastated room, observing the total destruction I had carefully orchestrated. They tried to take my home and my money. I took their dignity, their future, and their freedom. The vendor mutiny was now complete. The sudden wailing sound of police sirens pierced through the cold, heavy silence of the stripped-down grand ballroom. The noise started as a distant echo but quickly grew into a deafening roar as multiple cruisers sped up the long gravel driveway of the estate. Bright flashing red and blue lights illuminated the large glass windows, casting eerie shadows across the faces of the terrified bride and groom. The remaining wealthy guests froze in place, completely mesmerized by the impending climax of this massive disaster. Chloe looked frantically toward the front entrance, her chest heaving with fresh panic. She knew exactly what those sirens meant. The arrogant illusion she had built was becoming a federal crime scene. She tried to take a step backward, but the heavy fabric of her expensive white silk wedding dress tangled around her ankles, completely trapping her in place. Andre stood frozen near the altar, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He looked at me pleading silently, but I offered absolutely no comfort. I stood perfectly still with my hands clasped firmly behind my back, waiting for justice. The heavy wooden double doors at the main entrance burst open. A team of 6 uniformed police officers marched aggressively into the room. They were led by a tall, stern detective holding a thick stack of official legal documents. The officers spread out quickly, forming a tight perimeter to ensure no one could escape the room. The detective walked straight down the center aisle, completely ignoring the stunned whispers of the wealthy socialites. He marched directly toward the altar where my son and his bride were standing like deer caught in headlights. Chloe began to shake uncontrollably. She looked at her parents silently, begging them to use their money to stop the officers. Charles and Evelyn remained firmly in their seats, refusing to make eye contact with their daughter. The detective stopped a few feet away from Chloe and Andre. He unfolded the official paperwork and spoke in a booming, authoritative voice that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He announced that he held active federal arrest warrants signed by the night court judge. He stated the names of the accused clearly. He declared that Chloe and Andre Pierce were being placed under immediate arrest for multiple severe felony charges, including conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, identity theft, and the severe financial exploitation of a vulnerable senior citizen. The heavy weight of the criminal charges hung thickly in the tense air. Chloe let out a loud, piercing shriek that echoed painfully through the empty ballroom. She shook her head frantically, sending her perfectly styled hair falling into a messy tangle around her tear-stained face. "This is a massive mistake," she screamed at the detective, pointing a trembling finger directly at me. "He is the one who is lying to you. He is just a crazy old man trying to ruin my life. I am a Montgomery, and my family will sue this police department into total bankruptcy." The detective did not flinch at her threats. He simply signaled to 2 female officers standing behind him. The officers stepped forward quickly and grabbed Chloe by her arms. She fought them wildly, kicking and thrashing in her $15,000 custom wedding dress. The beautiful white silk tore loudly as she struggled against the firm grip of the trained officers. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the detective ordered, his voice devoid of any sympathy. Chloe continued to scream, but the officers easily overpowered her. They forced her arms behind her back, and the cold, heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly shut around her delicate wrists. The sound of the locking metal was beautiful music. Chloe looked down at the shiny steel bracelets trapping her hands and let out a pathetic, wailing sob. She turned her desperate, tear-filled eyes toward her parents. "Daddy, please help me," she cried out, her voice cracking with pure terror. "Call your lawyers right now. Do not let them take me away in my wedding dress." Charles slowly stood up from his velvet chair. He looked at his daughter, the child he had spoiled her entire life. He saw a convicted felon who had completely humiliated his prestigious family name in front of his business associates. Charles buttoned his suit jacket and looked at the detective. "Take her away," Charles said, his voice cold and completely detached. "My wife and I have absolutely no relation to this criminal anymore. She has made her choices, and she will suffer the consequences alone." Evelyn stood up next to her husband and nodded in solemn agreement. They turned their backs on their sobbing daughter and began walking toward the exit doors. Chloe screamed for her mother, but Evelyn did not pause her stride. The brutal rejection completely broke the last shred of her arrogant spirit. She collapsed against the police officers, weeping loudly as reality set in. While Chloe was completely falling apart, another pair of police officers approached my son. Andre had not moved a single muscle since the doors burst open. He was trembling so violently that his expensive custom tuxedo jacket was visibly shaking. An officer grabbed his arm and spun him around roughly. Andre let out a soft, pathetic whimper as his hands were forced behind his back. The cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, echoing the exact same trap that had just claimed his bride. The officer began reading him his rights, but Andre was not listening to a single word. He turned his head and looked directly at me. Tears were streaming heavily down his face, ruining his perfect grooming. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice nothing more than a desperate, broken whisper. "Please tell them to stop. I am your only son. I am so sorry for everything we did to you. I will give you all the money back. Just please do not let them send me to federal prison. I will do anything you want. Dad, please save me." I looked at the boy I had raised from a baby. I thought about the thousands of hours I worked. I thought about the promises he made when his mother died. And then I thought about the forged power of attorney and the way he threw me away like garbage to please a greedy woman. I took a deep breath and looked directly in his tear-filled eyes. "You made your choice, son," I said, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of parental warmth. You chose your path, and now you must walk to the end alone." I turned my back on him, severing the final tie between us. Andre let out an agonizing cry of despair. The officers gripped his arms tightly and began marching him down the aisle. The other officers dragged Chloe right behind him. The criminals were paraded straight through the ballroom in front of their wealthy friends. Marcus the photographer followed, capturing every second of their humiliating exit with his camera. The flashing red and blue lights swallowed them up as they were shoved aggressively into the waiting squad cars. I stood alone, listening to the sirens fade. The flashing red and blue lights finally disappeared down the long gravel driveway, taking my son and his vicious bride away to face the severe consequences of their own actions. Inside the grand ballroom, the remaining wealthy guests scrambled toward the exit doors. They did not speak to me. They kept their heads down, murmuring in hushed, frightened whispers as they rushed out into the warm Atlanta afternoon. They just wanted to escape the massive scandal that had completely shattered their perfect high society illusion. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, simply watching them leave. Within 20 minutes, the massive estate was entirely empty. The luxury vehicles drove away, leaving behind nothing but the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the soft echo of my own breathing. I walked slowly through the stripped-down ballroom. The towering floral arches were gone. The expensive silk tablecloths were packed away. The crystal champagne glasses were removed. The room was nothing more than a large empty space now. Richard, the venue manager, walked out from the back office carrying a heavy crystal decanter filled with aged amber bourbon and a single glass. He walked over to me with a look of profound respect on his face. He poured a generous amount of the expensive liquor into the crystal glass and handed it to me silently. I nodded my thanks, and Richard quickly walked away, leaving me completely alone to process the magnitude of the day. I walked over to the front row and sat down in the exact same velvet chair I had occupied during the disastrous ceremony. I took a slow, deep sip of the aged bourbon. The liquid burned pleasantly on its way down, warming my chest and settling the last remaining traces of adrenaline pumping through my veins. The silence of the empty ballroom was absolutely beautiful. It was the sound of complete and total victory. I reached into the inner pocket of my custom-tailored jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen and opened my secure banking application. I navigated to my primary private wealth accounts. A bright green notification banner appeared at the very top of the screen. The escrow account containing the nearly $400,000 from the fraudulent sale of my home had been entirely liquidated. The funds were safely transferred back into my heavily protected personal vault. I checked another notification from my lawyer, Jonathan. He had successfully filed the emergency injunction to completely nullify the forged power of attorney. The deed to my beautiful 4-bedroom house was officially cleared of the fraudulent sale and secured solely under my legal name once again. The $85,000 they stole from my checking account was also fully recovered and deposited back where it belonged. I locked the screen of my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I leaned back in the plush velvet chair and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I felt a deep, profound sense of absolute peace. I had spent my entire life working tirelessly to build a strong foundation for my family. I had endured the grease and the grime of the railway yard so my son would never have to struggle. I had sacrificed my own comfort to ensure he had every possible advantage in life. But I had finally learned that you cannot buy loyalty, and you certainly cannot teach gratitude to someone who is blinded by pure greed. Andre made his choice. He chose the shallow, empty promises of a wicked woman over the unconditional love of his own father. He tried to tear down the empire I built with my own 2 hands. But my empire was built on solid rock, not fragile lies. I took another sip of my bourbon and opened my eyes. I looked out over the massive empty ballroom that I now owned. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of my own justice. I survived their betrayal, and I emerged stronger, wealthier, and more peaceful than ever before. I raised my crystal glass in a silent toast to the quiet strength of every single person who has ever been completely underestimated by the people they love. The battle was officially over, and the old king had finally reclaimed his rightful, peaceful throne. I finished the delicious bourbon, enjoying the quiet afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. I felt a gentle breeze brush against my face, reminding me that a brand new chapter was just beginning. I had protected the legacy of my late wife Vivian and secured my own happiness. Today, I finally won my absolute freedom back forever now. I am truly ready to live the rest of my long life in peace. Betrayal often wears the face of those we trust the most, hiding behind fake smiles and entitled demands. I learned that silence is not weakness, it is the ultimate weapon of the wise. You cannot build your paradise by burning down the home of another person, especially the one who sheltered you. Blood makes you related, but loyalty proves you are family. I spent my life providing, but my greatest victory was learning to protect my own peace. Let them underestimate you. Let them think they have won. Because when the truth finally strikes, it takes everything they value. Did you like my story? Let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. If you enjoyed this lesson, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so I can keep bringing you more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support, and I will see you in the next life story.